So this morning I wanted to kind of go to the basics, but also mix it up a little bit with psychology. I haven't done that in a while, and I really love combining psychology and Zen together. So the basics of Zen, meaning the Four Noble Truths. So that is that there is suffering, there's causes for suffering, there's an end to suffering, and then there's a path to ending suffering. So I'm going to focus today on the path of ending suffering. I love podcasts. And one of my favorite podcasts is Hidden Brain, if any of you listen to it. And they go over a lot of like new psychology research, and I love it so much. So I wanted to share that with all of you because it's kind of a common everyday thing that I think most of us are facing in our modern world. So I just want to highlight some things that she talked about in this research. And if you're interested, it's actually called, they do a U 2.0 series every year in terms of new research on how to do that. So one of the people that they had on, her name was Anna Lembke. She recently did some research and wrote a book called Dopamine Nation: Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And so what she's talking about here is our brains, our primal part of our brains are hardwired for scarcity. So, back in the day when we didn't have grocery stores and instant, I can get something right now on Amazon in 2 days or even a day now, we would have to go out and look for it. So we had to put some work into it. We might have to walk for miles. And while we're doing that, we might be, hungry and kind of tired from doing all this walking. And then we finally get to that food or item that we wanted. And we're like, oh, yeah, this is so wonderful. But in doing this in the modern day world, where like you can literally sit on your couch and on your phone, just order anything you want, and it's almost instantly there. And looking at how that has affected our brains in the modern era, recently within the last 20 years. So she talked about some neuroscience with this, and with the neuroscience, she actually made an example kind of like a seesaw or teeter-totter. So pain and pleasure are actually in the same space in our brain. And so she said, if you imagine like let's say, eat a piece of chocolate. So then what happens is dopamine gets released and the pleasure one goes down. So we're getting that chocolate, we're getting that dopamine release, and it feels really, really good. And then what happens is the brain, when it's that you're done eating that piece of chocolate, it actually, instead of going back to homeostasis, which would be neutral, it actually goes to pain. And so how we receive that is a craving. Oh, I want another one. Oh, okay. And so then we could eat another one, and then it goes back over to the pleasure, and then we're done with that one, and it goes back to that little pain part. Oh, I want another one. And so what you do is, instead of giving into that craving, you give it a second. And she said, your mind will reset on its own and it'll go back to homeostasis so that you're not craving that chocolate anymore. And so that's like on a small scale, but she gets into a bigger scale of how that works. So dopamine is responsible for pleasure, motivation, and reward. So those are the three things that's going on when we're doing pleasurable events. And she talks about how we live in a world of everything is pleasure all the time. And what's happening is, and what she's noticing, she's a psychiatrist, by the way, with a lot of her patients, is that people are running around nowadays in a constant, she calls it a dopamine deficit. And what does a dopamine deficit look like? Irritability, restlessness, sometimes insomnia. I'm missing a few of them here. Anxiety and depression, the main ones. And so then what happens when we get into this deficit is we're constantly seeking, I don't want to be in this deficit, right? But this is all subconscious. We're not actually thinking about this. I want to feel better. So what's the thing to feel better? Whatever that thing is. And so it tips it back into the pleasure. So I'll give you an example. She actually was very open, and she talks about this in her book, that she noticed it happened to herself. Now, while it was happening to herself, she didn't realize it in the moment, but she only realized it in hindsight. But she had one of her friends, they were talking about this new Twilight series book and they were loving it. She's like, oh, I'll give it a try. I'll read it. So she starts reading the Twilight series and she's loving it, right? And so this, by the way, happened over a span of 1 to 2 years, this story I'm going to tell you. And so she noticed she was done with that series. And then she's like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll read it again. Maybe I'll get, more pleasure or the same. So she read the series again. It's like, not really as much, okay, let me try a different series. So then she tried another vampire romance novel series. And then so that kind of got boring. Oh, well, let me try another genre of romance novels. So then did that for a while. And after that time, then that kind of got like not hitting that same pleasure center it was hitting before. So then she started getting more like intense erotica books. And then she was noticing she was like, I don't want people to know I'm reading this. So she got a Kindle. So she with the Kindle was like, oh, okay. Well, when you get a Kindle, what happens when you read books in series? It suggests some for you. Oh, you liked this? Read this. So she's like, oh, this Kindle's awesome. And so then and then the Kindle's even offering her free books and genres that she likes. Oh my gosh, that's even better, right? So then she keeps, reading this, and then to the point where she started to notice that she was like the daily activities of what she was doing, that she was like hurrying up to get them done so she could get to read that romance novel. And then it got to a point at one time that she found herself up at 3 a.m. reading and then of course tired the next day. And while all this was going on, she didn't really see an issue with it. She kind of joked around with it. Like she would just say to her friends, oh yeah, I'm addicted to romance vampire novels, and whatever. But when she was at 3 a.m. reading and realizing, it kind of dawned on her, like, what am I doing? How did I get here? How am I reading? I think the book that she was reading was, oh gosh, it's the S&M one. I can't remember now. The same as back in the day. 50 Shades of Grey. Thank you. And she's like, I don't even like this stuff. What am I doing? So she's like, that's it. I'm cutting myself off. I'm just going to take a break from this. And so when she did that, she realized she was experiencing the same withdrawal symptoms that her patients were when they stopped using substances: irritability, insomnia, depression, anxiety. She said that lasted for 10 to 14 days until that finally went away. And what happened was she was constantly going pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so then she went over here to the pain and then the brain. And it took a while for it to get back to homeostasis. So she has 3 things that she recommends if you're finding yourself in this kind of a situation. So the first thing is to whatever it is, and like in this situation for her, it was romance novels, to just for 4 weeks stop doing that behavior, whatever that is. And when you're doing that 4 weeks, the second step is sitting with discomfort, because just like what happened to her, she had to sit with that discomfort of the anxiety and the kind of feeling, a little bit down and restlessness, sleeplessness. And then the third thing is, she says, intentionally do things that are physically hard or mentally hard to do. So that could be, going, working out an exercise or a mental activity that would be a little bit difficult or hard. And those are the 3 things she says that you can do to basically reset yourself to being at that homeostasis. And there's more I want to say to all of this, but what comes to mind in terms of how I relate this to my practice, it's unplugging, right? In terms of not, sitting in meditation, sitting in zazen, doing retreats. I love retreats for that reason. And then you're not just unplugging, but you also are you're sitting with a little bit of discomfort. Like, oh, my knee's a little bit achy, or back, whatever that is. But you're sitting with the discomfort, you're unplugged, and you're away from all of the stimulus. It's constant. At least I notice it. Constant stimulus. And it's everywhere. Like I remember when, like 20 years ago, I lived in Maryland at the time, and I used to visit this small Anne Arundel County mall. And all of a sudden, like one day, they decided it would be a good idea to put these big screens all over the mall. So no matter where you were constantly bombarded with screens of advertisement and noise and all of that kind of stuff. And then a few years down the line, go to a restaurant, and it's like, you can't find a restaurant where, you know, there's not a TV on each individual booth. And I'm like, my goodness, we can't even just sit and talk to each other. Okay. And then to, you know, now where you have your phone at your smartphone everywhere. I know I do. I mean, it's hard to not go somewhere and have your phone. Like, and then again, Zazen, yeah, going to retreats, taking that phone away, everything completely unplugged, so that I can focus on what's going on within me, connecting to nature, connecting to the Sangha, but not in a way where I'm having to talk or listen, just connecting, just being, getting away from all of the modernization stuff. Yeah, like recently I went on a cruise with my family, and I've been going on cruises for a while now. I love them, mainly because there's no phone. Nobody can contact me. All I can see is the ocean for as far as I can see. And it just brings me so much peace. It's just, it's like, I feel like I'm breathing. It's almost like another way of doing Zazen. And then this last cruise I went on with my family, you had to have your cell phone. They made it to where you had to have your cell phone if you wanted to know the activities of the day. It used to be back in the day when I used to go, they would just give you a printed sheet of, here's everything. If you want to do something, you can look at it. You weren't going to know what was going on unless you had a cell phone and you were connected to their app and all of that. So even going, sometimes I've noticed, even going to a restaurant nowadays, you have to have a smartphone. I was in London, I don't know when it was, a couple of years ago. And if literally you could not eat at the restaurant if you didn't have your cell phone. You had to, there was the barcode, you had to scan it, and then to get the menu, then you looked at the menu, and then once you then you had to order it online and everything. Now I get it, this is all innovative and it's wonderful in a lot of ways. But in some ways, this is kind of looking at how this overload affects our brains, because our brains have evolved again to be scarcity. And here we're living in a modern world where everything is plentiful. Everything is at your fingertips. So she gave an example. Well, they actually both got into a conversation and did an example on the date, like back when we had to forage for things and find food in different ways. They were talking about looking for a date tree. So walking for miles, like I said, to go and find a date tree. You finally get to the date, and because you're paying like this, like I said, and then you finally eat the date, and it's like, oh yay, it's so good. And she said what happens in the brain, she goes, is that just like from having that like intoxicating feeling of going from being in pain to all of a sudden all this pleasure, that, well, let me find my notes to make sure I say this right, that it mimics in the brain going from homeostasis, where we are in the modern world, and then using an intoxicant and getting high, because your brain going from the pain to pleasure seesaw. So it mimics that for us in the modern world today. So instead of going from this pain to pleasure, we go from homeostasis, finding that date, and then it's like an intoxicant, just as if you were to, have a drink or do a drug or something. So we'll look at my notes here for a moment. So what happens in the modern world, she gives an example of, okay, you want dates, great. You order dates and you order them on Amazon. You can order a whole crate of them if you want, and you get them there. And then usually in today's standards, there's either sugars or fats to it to make it taste better. And then you get that dopamine release. And again, so you eat it, and then it goes back to just like the chocolate. You go into pain, and then, oh, well, let's have another one, craving. So it has that same seesaw effect. Okay. want to make sure I say all my notes and everything. So you can see how everyday things that we do as human beings can create this constant imbalance. It's kind of the point of what she was making. And how can we be aware of that when that's happening within us and to balance it better? And so some of the things that she talked about, if it's possible, is to not have whatever that item or thing is in your house. Try to limit your use. Like say, I'm only going to like be on social media for an hour or whatever that is, to limit yourself in one way and to change your environment. Those are some examples that she gave. So there was another episode on hidden brain, and this was on savoring. So this savoring is where you use positive psychology and you mix it with mindfulness, basically, because our brains are wired to think and remember the negative, our negative experiences, or or even what we don't like about ourselves. And that's all about evolution of avoiding getting hurt or avoiding pain. And so and our brains are also wired to want to go to pleasure and go away from pain, which goes to what we were talking about in the other podcast. So his idea to create more balance within our brains, to have more of that kind of mindfulness, positive psychology experience, is to look for and savor everyday things that we do. Sounds very Zen, right? So we just need a modern science apparently to tell us that we're doing the right thing. So just in doing that, to try to look at whatever everyday activity you're doing from a curious perspective. I remember I did this once. I went on a walk. I've talked about it before, but I went on a walk, and the whole walk, I tried to not put a label to anything, like that's a tree or it's green or anything like that. It just kept bringing it back to this curious observer space, and it was amazing how wonderful that walk was. I would go up and just touch leaves as if I'd never seen a leaf before. It just kind of what does that feel like? What is this? And it was a really amazing exercise, and in a way that's kind of what he's suggesting or pointing to. So he gives 10 different steps for this. So in terms of how to best savor a moment. So one of the things that he says that helps research says that when you savor a moment, it's helpful to share it with somebody else. Makes sense, that feeling of connection. It helps you to savor it a little bit more by sharing it with someone. He says also take a mental photograph. This is mindfulness, right? So pausing and bringing to awareness everything that's happening using your 5 senses. Think about all the things that you want to remember about this moment right here. Then he says, congratulate yourself, praise yourself for using this mindfulness practice and being able to savor it, because this is the positive psychology piece of it. In terms of balancing our minds, because we usually are, when we're in the moment, even if we are taking it in, there's some kind of, I have to do this or have to do that, or something in the background noise. He says that, so instead of having that negativity there, go ahead and praise yourself and be kind to yourself for being able to take part in this practice that you're doing, that you're taking time to savor. Also, he says, sharpen your sensory perception. So take time to really hone in all of your 5 senses of what's going on in this experience. It's mindfulness. Then he talks about, he says, shout it from the rooftops. He said, just kind of like almost like a little kid, like when you're really savoring into the moment, he said you could jump up and down, or you could just like be in glee, like, just imagine like a little kid, kind of allowing yourself that space to do that. compare the outcome to something worse. So an example he gave for this was he was talking about a moment where he was wanting to exercise, but kind of not feeling like exercising. And so he thought of a moment in time, he put like where he's, you know, maybe in a wheelchair, really old, can't walk anymore, whatever the situation is. And he says, okay, imagine I'm there and I am thinking about, oh my God, it was so wonderful to be able to run. Oh my gosh, I wish I could do that now. So he puts himself in that headspace, and then he goes, oh, and then I put myself back in the moment in time, and I open my eyes, and I'm here. I'm at this space. I can run. And then like using that enthusiasm to get to do the activity that he was wanting to do. Getting absorbed in the moment, kind of going with what we were talking about with using your five senses. Count your blessings and have gratitude, having gratitude for the moment that you're in. And so not just noticing everything around you in that moment and savoring it, but the gratitude of being able to be in that experience. Avoid killjoy thinking, he says. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll compare ourselves either to other people or other situations. And that's a killjoy moment because whenever we're comparing, usually that's going to create negative thoughts. So we want to avoid that. And the last one, which is to me very Zen, remind yourself of how quickly time flies and is fleeting. That this moment is just here right now, and it's never going to be like this again. Impermanence, right? We have this moment right here, right now, to savor and enjoy and share with other people. And so just by reminding ourselves of that, psychologically, it helps us enjoy the moment better by just that gentle reminder. So I'm sure I didn't say all of the things I wanted to say because that's typically what happens. I'll be done with talking and I'll go, oh man, I didn't talk about this or whatever. So I recommend highly listening to the whole 2.8 series. It's really, really good. I always find for me that all this new psychology and research totally relates to Zen and what I'm doing in Zen, what I'm doing in my practice, and sometimes even helps accentuate it and learning how the brain works. So yeah, thank you all so much.